Welcome to The Explainer. So, today we're going to unpack a really fascinating story how one single campaign promise literally plunged France into this bitter, year-long culture war, all over the definition of marriage. Okay, so to really get a grip on the firestorm that erupted in 2013, we actually have to rewind a bit back to 1999. This is when France creating a civil union, you might have heard of it, called the Pax, and it was available to all couples. Now, on the surface, you think, okay, great, a progressive solution, right? But that's the central question, isn't it? If they already had this civil union, why on earth did the fight for full marriage equality nearly tear the country apart just a decade later? Well, the answer, as it so often is in the details, specifically in what that original compromise left out. So let's dig into that. Okay, so this section is all about that unfinished compromise because the real conflict, it wasn't sparked by the rights that were granted back in 99. No, it was all about the rights that were very, very deliberately withheld. So this Pax, it was a huge step for sure. But here's the thing. It was designed to be incomplete. It gave couples legal status, some tax benefits, things like that. But it intentionally stopped short of the full rights of marriage. And the two big ones were joint adoption and inheritance. So what you ended up with was this kind of two-tiered system. And that question of full equality, it was just left there, simmering under the surface. And get this legal wall was basically built right before the Pax even existed. Just 2 years earlier, in 1997, France's highest court made a huge ruling. They said that a marriage-like relationship, well, that could only be between a man and a woman. So this wasn't just some dusty old tradition, it was a modern legal precedent. It basically set the stage for the massive fight that was coming. So you have this simmering tension, right? And then a single campaign promise comes along and just pours gasoline on the fire. Okay, so here's how it went down. In 2012, presidential candidate François Hollande makes this promise. It was called Engagement 31, to open up marriage and adoption to same-sex couples. It was a core part of his campaign. And the backlash was immediate and incredibly organized. The opposition didn't just write letters. They mobilized. They created this massive movement called La Manif pour tous, which means the protest for all. And their strategy was brilliant, in a way. They framed it not as an issue of equality, but as an attack on the family itself. The battle lines were drawn right then and there. All right, so with the promise made and the opposition mobilized, the fight moves into the political arena, into Parliament. And what happened next was one of the most intense legislative battles in modern French history. The bill itself was often just called the Taubira Law, and that's because it was championed by the Minister of Justice, Christiane Taubira. I mean, she fought for it with such passion and eloquence that her name just became synonymous with the whole effort. Okay, now look at this number, 5,362. What is that? That's the number of amendments the opposition filed to try and block this law. It's basically a filibuster by paperwork. The goal was to just grind the entire legislative process to a halt and show everyone just how fiercely they were going to fight this. And all those amendments? They led to an absolute marathon session in Parliament. We're talking over 109 hours for just the initial debate in the National Assembly. That is almost 2 solid weeks of arguing day and night. The sheer length of it tells you this was way more than just a bill. It was a fight over the very idea of what France was. So, after all that debate, the bill passed its first test. But just look at these numbers. It is so clearly drawn along party lines. You see the socialists? Almost all for. Then you look at the UMP, the main conservative party? Almost all against. This tells you it wasn't really a vote of individual conscience. It was pure political trench warfare. Next up, the bill goes to the Senate, France's upper house. And things were much tighter there. It did pass, but only narrowly. And here's a key point. They used a show of hands for the vote. The opposition was furious about this. They felt it was a shady procedural move to ram the law through without a clear, recorded vote for every senator. And that just threw more fuel on the fire. So the bill comes back to the National Assembly for the final, definitive vote. And on April 23, 2013, the numbers basically held. 331 in favor, 225 against. And just like that, after months and months of brutal debate, marriage for all was the law of the land. Well, pending a final constitutional review, anyway. But here's the thing.
While all this was happening inside the halls of Parliament, an entirely different battle was raging outside, on the streets. And this revealed a France that was deeply, and I mean visibly, divided.
Let's take January 13th, 2013. The opposition, La Manif pour tous, held a massive protest in Paris. The official police estimate? 340,000 people. I mean, that is a huge number for any protest anywhere. But the organizers, they claimed 1 million people were there. 1 million. Now, who do you believe? The police or the organizers? Honestly, it doesn't even matter. The massive gap between those two numbers tells you everything. This wasn't just a protest anymore. It was a war over who could claim to represent the real public opinion. And if you look at the actual polling data from back then, you see a much more complicated picture. Yeah, a clear majority of people in France, about 63%, were okay with marriage equality. But then you ask about adoption rights for same-sex couples, and look at that, it drops to 49%. The country was split right down the middle. And that was the real flashpoint, the real heart of the whole conflict. So the law is passed. The battle is, in theory, over. But what happens next? I mean, after all that fighting, all those protests, how does a law this controversial actually become a part of everyday life? Well, the government moved fast, really fast. The law was officially validated on May 17th, and just 12 days later, on May 29th, the very first same-sex marriage in France took place in Montpellier. And when some mayors tried to resist, saying they had a conscience clause that let them refuse to perform the ceremonies, the courts shut that down immediately. The message was clear: this is the law. And what's been the impact since then? Well, in just the first 10 years, over 77,000 same-sex couples have gotten married in France. And you can see here, even though it was this massive society-shaking reform, same-sex marriages have settled in at about 3% of all marriages in France each year. It's become a small but very stable part of the fabric of French life. It didn't really upend the institution of marriage, it just expanded who could be a part of it. And that brings us back to Christine Taubira, the law's champion. Remember, she didn't see this as just another piece of legislation. She famously called it a reform of civilization, a fundamental shift in how French society thinks about family and about equality. So, where does that leave us? The reform of civilization is now the law. The huge protests have faded away, and it's just a fact of French life. But what this whole battle showed us, what it laid bare, were these really deep fractures in French society. It wasn't just about changing a law, it was about forcing an entire nation to confront its own ideas about tradition, identity, and the very definition of family. And it's a powerful lesson, right? It teaches us that the path of social change is almost never smooth. It's often a messy, loud, and painful clash that redefines a country.